One of the dangers of being related to a preacher is that you learn very quickly that anything and everything can be turned into a sermon illustration. So just a story from my own family. When my oldest son was like 4 or 5 years old, I told an embarrassing story about him once in a sermon. So after church that Sunday, he looked at me very sternly, kind of like he's looking at me here in this picture, and he said, "Dad, the next time you tell a story about me, you need to ask my permission first." He was dead serious. And from that point on, I did. I actually did, except for today. I'm going to tell some stories today, and I didn't ask their permission. As a person of faith, I believe God is at work around me all the time. And as a pastor who's called on to preach and teach about God, I'm constantly making connections between the things I see and the stories I find in Scripture. My kids sometimes tease me about that. They tease me that I see Jesus in everything. And they're not wrong. I see echoes of the good news in movies and TV shows and in music, and not even just the music on Christian radio, other kinds of music too. I see a reflection of Jesus in my kids' lives as well. Now, I'm proud of my kids for a lot of different reasons. I consider the fact that they're all financially independent to be one of the greatest things that's happened in the 21st century, for instance. It doesn't get much better than that. But the things about my kids that make me proudest have nothing to do with money or work or anything like that. They have to do with the way they love others, like Jesus did. So I'm going to brag about my kids a little bit here. My daughter, for instance, Lauren, she volunteers with the Big Sister program in Dayton, Ohio, and she mentors a little girl there, and she's been doing that for a while. She's also maintained one of the best and most diverse friend groups I've ever seen. About half of those are kids that grew up at the church where I was pastor, and some of them are kids that she went to church camp with that have since moved to the area, mainly to be closer to her. For the past few years, she's brought about a dozen of them with her to Iowa for the 4th of July, to my house. And last year, this is a picture of some of the kids that were there. They're not kids now, they're all in their 30s, but this was right after the derecho, and we spent the first 3 days without any electricity or air conditioning. And I told them, this is probably what you're going to be in for. But they're such a good group, it didn't matter. They even got up, got dressed in the heat, and came to church with me. And this was the picture we took after church that day. My oldest son, Ryan, the one who told me to ask permission anytime I told a story about him, he volunteered. He was a missionary intern with the Division of Overseas Ministries right out of college. And he went to India, and he was given a choice. At that point, he could work at a school, or he could work at a hospice taking care of people who were dying of AIDS. Okay, this was back in the 90s, early 2000s. He chose the hospice. That's what he chose. He once broke up with a girl he was dating when he was in grad school because she was mean to the wait staff at restaurants. So that tells you a little something about him too. My younger son, Joel, once took the blame for something that wasn't his fault, and it was kind of a serious deal at the time, simply because he knew that his friend would suffer so much more if he were the one held responsible. Took the blame, didn't say anything about it. When he was in high school, he stood up to his friends on his wrestling team because they wanted to haze the underclassmen, like they'd been hazed when they were freshmen. As team captain his junior and senior year, he wouldn't let them do it. He got in between them, his friends, and the underclassmen, and stopped them from doing that. See what I mean when I say I see Jesus reflected in them? Now, I'd love to take some of the credit for that, but in the end, those were choices that they made for themselves. And in the end, those are the kinds of choices that we have to make for ourselves too. Now, we know from reading the Gospels that Jesus talked a lot about the need to humble ourselves and serve one another. And we also know from reading those same stories that Jesus' closest disciples often had no idea what he was talking about. Last week, we read the first of Jesus' 3 predictions. We're going to do all 3 of them this Lent. The first of his 3 predictions in the Gospel of Mark about his impending death and resurrection. And we read how Peter confessed that Jesus was the Christ. He said, "You're the Messiah, you're the Christ." But then he turned around and he rebuked Jesus when Jesus explained to him what that meant, that he must go to Jerusalem and be crucified and die. Peter and the other disciples still believed Jesus was going to be a warrior king, that his success was going to be measured the same way most human success is measured, by money, power, status, fame, all of that. That section, the story about Peter, ends with Jesus saying that anyone who wants to follow him, and he said this to all the disciples, anyone who wants to follow me must also pick up their cross and follow. That's how that prediction ended. Our scripture reading for today is the second time Jesus talks about his impending suffering and death. And once again, the disciples are clueless. And once again, Jesus clarifies for them what it means for him to walk in the way of the cross. So we read in Mark chapter 9, beginning at verse 30, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, 'The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again.' But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, 'What were you arguing about on the way?' But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, 'Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all.' Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, 'Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me.'" You know how sometimes parents give their kids a chance to confess their sin, right? They'll say something like, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" Right? At that point, you better confess. In this case, Jesus says, "What exactly were you guys arguing about on the way into Capernaum?" Now, I'm pretty sure Jesus had a very good understanding of what they were arguing about. They weren't talking about where they were going to eat that night, right? One of the things I really love about this story is that Jesus waited until they were in private before he corrects them. It reminds me of what my dad used to do with me at church when I was a kid. Instead of just spanking me on the spot and making a scene, which I'm sure he was tempted to do, instead he'd give me a warning. He'd say, whisper usually, "If you do that one more time, you're getting a spanking when we get home." Right? And of course, me being me, I did whatever it was he told me not to do. And then he would just look at me and nod, right? And then I would spend the next couple of hours praying that he would forget his promise. And he never did. Mark tells us when they reached the house where they were staying, Jesus hit them with a question. He wanted to hear it from them, but they were silent. And the reason they were silent was because what they were arguing about was a contradiction to everything he'd been teaching them. Jesus had been telling them to humble themselves and take up their cross. He'd been telling them how they needed to love and serve others, especially those who were powerless and weak. But they were arguing among themselves as to who was the greatest. Occasionally, I hear stories about the people who surround powerful politicians. And this is, I think, really pretty common. How those, sometimes maybe even call them flunkies, how they will wrangle with one another for power and influence. They backstab, they gossip, they leak things to the media. And the reason they do that is because they hope when their guy finally ascends the throne, that they'll be right there next to him to rule, right? That they'll get to share in his power. That's what the disciples were doing. It's exactly what they were doing. Even though Jesus told them, this is the second time he's told them now, he's going to suffer and die. They still don't get it. They still don't believe it. When I imagine Jesus asking the disciples what they were arguing about, I picture them doing one of two things. I picture them either looking at Jesus like deer in the headlights, knowing they're busted, right? Or maybe not even being able to make eye contact with him at all. Either way, Mark tells us that Jesus then sat down. This was a teachable moment. And he called the 12 to come and do the same, to sit down. Because in the Jewish tradition, when a rabbi sits down, that means he's going to teach. That means he's got something to say. This time, when Jesus teaches his disciples, he doesn't talk about taking up a cross, even though that's still true. This time, he tells the disciples they are to be servants. He said, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. In other words, if you're really interested in being the greatest, the best way to prove that is by loving and serving even the least of these. And then, to illustrate his point, Jesus took a little child into his lap and he said, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. In other words, you can't get any closer to God than that. Right there. Now, the funny thing about this teaching, it occurred to me this week, is that it could sound like Jesus is talking about how important it is to take care of kids, right? Which isn't particularly controversial, especially in our culture, right? Kids should be a priority, right? We should take care of them, we should protect them, but that's not what Jesus was saying. In the ancient world, kids were the opposite of great. They were takers, not givers. They didn't produce anything. They were the lowest on the social totem pole. They were dependent. They were vulnerable. That's what Jesus was getting at when he took a child to himself. The French philosopher Goethe once said this: you can easily judge the character of a man by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. I think that's what Jesus was doing here. I think this is what he was getting at. Greatness is not defined by our power over, but by our service to people who can do nothing for us. For followers of Jesus, that means we never punch down. You know what I mean by that? We don't abuse people who are vulnerable and powerless. I don't care what's going on with them. You just don't do that. And we certainly don't play favorites with the rich and powerful. The letter of James in the New Testament addresses this issue. This came to mind this week as I was thinking about this. He addresses this issue in the context of the early church, and it's amazingly applicable even today. James writes, "My brothers and sisters, do you with your acts of favoritism really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing fine clothes and say, 'Have a seat here, please,' while to the one who is poor you say, 'Stand there,' or 'Sit at my feet,' have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" Jesus said that when we welcome the least of these, we welcome him. And not just him, but the one who sent him. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus makes this same point in, I think, one of the most powerful of all his parables, the parable of the sheep and goats. In that parable, you may remember, the king says to the sheep after they're separated, right? One to go one way, one to go to the other. He says to the sheep, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And then, of course, he has another message for the goats that's not quite so positive. And when they object and when they say, wait a minute, Lord, when did we see you hungry or naked or in prison and not help you? The king says, when you failed to do it for the least of these, you failed to do it for me. Mother Teresa used to describe the beggars and the homeless people that she cared for on the streets of Calcutta as Jesus in his most distressing disguises. And it can be hard sometimes to welcome those who are in desperate need. Last night, the Homeless Alliance here in Keokuk had their fundraiser. They can tell you how hard it can be sometimes to care for people in desperate need. The men who work in our bed ministry can tell you stories. I guarantee the women who go to our laundromat every week and help people, or every other week now, and help people do their laundry too, can tell you stories. It isn't always easy, but that's what Jesus calls us to do. A couple of weeks ago, someone who was new to our Loads of Love laundry ministry came in, and they were so impressed by the love and the cooperation that they saw operating in the laundromat that night, because that's how it's been now. How many years have you been doing this now? We're in our 8th year that they've been doing it, and they've created a community there. They know how to get it done. They get a lot of laundry done on a Tuesday night. So a new family showed up, and they saw this, and they said, I want to meet the church that's behind this thing. First Christian Church has a long history of welcoming and caring for the least of these. Something else we do is feed people a lot. On Sunday mornings and on Wednesday nights, we feed anybody that walks in the door, literally hundreds of people every week. When we first started doing Simple Suppers in FCC Cafe a few years ago, we weren't sure how we were going to pay for all those meals. But the funds have come in. Those who can put a donation in the offering basket. And as far as I know, I think we've fully funded it. I think we've even had surpluses. As a church, we try to model Jesus' love and walk in the way of the cross. But Jesus' call to humility and service is meant to be reflected in our individual lives as well. Not just in our corporate life, that's important, but it should be reflected in our individual lives as well. What Jesus wants to see in us is a humility and love so genuine that we don't even have to think about it. It simply becomes second nature. It just becomes who we are. We love, we serve because Jesus first loved us. We do it so one day Jesus might say, well done, good and faithful servant. Come and take your rest in me. Because whatever you did with one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.